I can't cope, insiders. Project Thor has ramped up a gear. Not just one gear, the accelerator is on Project Thor. This is a huge problem because what we are seeing now is the mainstream media come on board, just like they did for the Jordan tour, just like they did when Harry came back to the UK.
The whole media capture play isn't random. It runs on a clear system once you see how PR really moves behind the scenes. The goal isn't flipping every outlet at once. That's way too messy. Instead, they go for the easy wins first, the smaller platforms, the softer voices, the ones more open to deals and less likely to dig deep once a few positive stories start rolling out. Once 4 outlets are already pushing good press, the tone gets locked in and nobody wants to be the odd one out. Then the pressure spreads, and it's all about competition. If Heat magazine is getting inside quotes and polished content, the Daily Express starts thinking, why not us? And suddenly, access becomes the prize everyone's chasing. But here's the catch. The cost of that access is playing nice and echoing the same glowing angle Heat already set up. Before long, the whole media space gets pulled in not by force, but step by step, story by story, stacking momentum until it feels like the only version out there. That's exactly the lens you need when looking at the Heat magazine feature. Because honestly, it reads less like reporting and more like a dressed up press drop. It pushes this vibe that the tide is turning, highlights boosted confidence after the Australia trip, and paints a slick blueprint that's supposed to impress the royals, everything lined up a little too perfectly to feel natural. These aren't the kind of insights a journalist pulls from digging and independent reporting. No chance! These are carefully shaped angles, the exact kind a PR team would want out there. Almost like a script being followed. You can see it in those source quotes. Harry supposedly pushing for a part-time return to royal life, talk about him believing the institution still needs him, Meghan backing it all, and the idea that he's ready to sit down with his father. That's not random chatter, that's messaging lined up with purpose.
And Meghan's team, I think, are working with the palace and working with the UK media outlets because Heat magazine have written what really reads to me like a press release. It's utterly ridiculous. It could be People magazine.
And every one of those points fits perfectly into a bigger plan. This is the kind of narrative that needs to be planted in public view to slowly rebuild an image piece by piece, headline by headline. It's not about one article doing all the work. It's about repeating the same themes until they start to sound like accepted truth. Now look at where this showed up Heat magazine, and it makes even more sense. This is the low-hanging fruit stage of the whole move. Heat isn't the Times, the Guardian, or the BBC. It lives in that softer celebrity lane, where royal coverage leans more toward entertainment than hard scrutiny. That makes it the perfect starting point, because the bar for verification just isn't the same. And here's where the strategy really clicks. A heavyweight outlet wouldn't run something this glowing off just source quotes alone, but Heat will, no problem. Once it's published though, it's officially out there, sitting in the public record. Then the next outlet can point to it, build on it, and make their version sound more solid, more verified. Bit by bit, the story climbs the ladder, picking up credibility as it goes until it feels way bigger than where it started. Each outlet builds off the last, pointing to earlier coverage like it's proof the story has real momentum. That's how the narrative starts to look legit. One article turns into many, and suddenly it feels like everyone's saying the same thing. But if you slow down and actually look at the claims, you'll see these aren't random ideas. They're the exact storylines. The whole image rebuild depends on people accepting. Take this angle. Harry and Meghan believe they're exactly what the royal family needs. That's a bold setup, and it flips everything on its head. It turns what looked like a commercial-style royal tour into something framed as a public service to the institution. Then comes the bigger twist, claims that they were somehow distracting from the Andrew scandal. That's not a small shift. That's a full rewrite of how people are supposed to see their role. Because now their time in Australia gets positioned as helpful, even protective of the institution, instead of controversial or disruptive. And that's where it gets wild. The reader is expected to overlook the fact that the same couple being framed as a distraction have also been tied to ongoing tension around the institution itself. It's a heavy switch, and it doesn't land without effort. Then there's that blueprint claim again. The idea that Harry is building something groundbreaking isn't new. It already showed up in Daily Telegraph sourcing. Now it's being echoed again, but this time through softer media channels, spreading wider and sounding more established with every repeat. The Jordan Tour gives a clear side-by-side example of how this media capture game actually plays out. On one side, you've got the official coverage approved channels pushing warm, polished, institution-friendly stories, all carefully focused on safe, adjacent topics. It's clean, controlled, and exactly what you'd expect from access-driven reporting. But then there's the other side, and it tells a very different story. Independent commentators and citizen journalists were sharing photos and raising questions like images with venue staff whose social media activity sparked controversy. These are the kinds of details that didn't make it into the mainstream coverage at all, not because they didn't exist, but because they weren't picked up or explored through those official routes. So now you've got two versions of reality moving at the same time. One flows through major outlets, polished and widely accepted, while the other circulates through alternative spaces, where people are digging into things that didn't get mainstream attention. That gap between the two isn't a coincidence. It's exactly what a strong PR setup is built to maintain, keeping certain narratives front and center while others stay on the edges. Then look at the Bondi Beach detail, because this is where things get very specific. The Heat magazine piece goes all in on the Australia trip, covering the hospital visit, the refuge lunch, fan selfies, the outfits, all of it. But there's one detail missing that stands out. The outfit worn at the Bondi Beach Memorial was reportedly listed for commercial sale on an AI retail platform just hours after the appearance, and that part never made it into the story. This isn't some random editorial miss, it's a choice, plain and simple. When access is part of the deal, certain details just don't make the cut. If a piece of information makes the subject look bad, it quietly disappears from coverage tied to that access. Meanwhile, the outlets that do report those uncomfortable details, they're usually the ones operating without those behind-the-scenes arrangements. And on the flip side, the ones with access stay quiet because that's the trade-off. Now look at something more concrete, the Royal Rota photographer, Jonathan Brady. He was flown all the way from London to Australia to act as the official pool photographer for what was labeled a private visit. That's not small, and it's not a coincidence. This isn't just the palace stepping back and letting things play out that would be passive. This is active involvement, clear as day. Sending a palace-approved photographer through established press channels is a whole different level of participation. It signals coordination, not coincidence. Brady being there isn't just a detail, it's a marker of institutional backing, even if it's not openly framed that way. And here's the key part. The managed version of the story needs that involvement to stay low-key, almost invisible, while independent reporting is the place where it actually gets pointed out. And this isn't just about one tour, it sets the stage for what comes next. Because the way this media dynamic plays out will shape what people see during any future return. If enough outlets have already bought into the softer narrative by then, coverage later on could completely sidestep tougher details like polling numbers, event turnout, visible gaps in crowd presence, or even formal complaints. The tone will already be set, and anything that doesn't fit it risks being pushed out of sight. The summer coverage is already being set up, and you can see exactly where it's headed. It will point back to the Australia blueprint, highlight the charitable stops, and lean hard on the warm public reception captured by approved photographers. That version will look polished and consistent, but sitting right next to it will be a completely different record. Citizen journalists, alternative commentators, and outlets without access will be showing details that don't match the polished version at all. And that gap? It's the same split that's been there since the Jordan Tour. It never really closed. One of the most revealing parts comes from understanding how PR actually works behind the scenes. Once you see it, you can't miss it. The articles start reading less like reporting and more like ready-made press material. The wording feels intentional, almost scripted, hitting the exact notes a communications team would want out in public. Look closer, and it gets even clearer. These pieces include the lines that benefit the narrative, leave out the ones that don't, and rely on vague attributions like insiders or sources close to the couple. In many cases, those sources are likely tied directly to the communication pipeline, either part of the PR team or people briefed to deliver specific talking points. That's how the message stays tight and consistent across different outlets. Reading coverage this way changes everything. It's not just about what's said, it's about what's missing, who's saying it, and which outlets are repeating the same polished tone. Some are clearly running with that press release style approach, while others are doing more independent digging. That contrast is something alternative media spaces have been sharpening their eye for over the past few years. And right in the middle of it all, the Heat magazine piece drops another key line that the Australia visit was basically a test run for a similar trip to the UK. This part lines up, but there's an extra twist. It matches what Sussex sources reportedly told the Daily Telegraph, framed more formally as a blueprint, but Heat takes it a step further. Their version adds a sharper angle, claims that Harry is pushing for a part-time return to royal life, that he believes the institution needs both him and Meghan, and that he's ready to sit down with his father to make it happen. That's not just background detail, that's a very specific direction being pushed. And those points aren't random, they read like clear objectives. These are the exact goals being fed into the media through carefully placed source quotes, aimed at outlets that are more open to running them. It's structured, deliberate, and repeated for a reason. But here's where the distinction matters. These aren't Prince William's goals, and they don't reflect the institution's documented position either. These are being framed as Harry's objectives presented through a media environment that's already leaning towards certain narratives. The idea is simple. Repeat it enough times, across enough platforms, and it starts to feel less like one side's perspective and more like the likely outcome. That's where the long game comes in. This kind of normalization doesn't happen overnight, it builds step by step. Every favorable article adds a layer of credibility to the next one. Every outlet that echoes the same message makes opposing coverage seem smaller by comparison. And with each repeat of the blueprint angle, it starts to sound more established, more real, and even a little inevitable. By the time Harry arrives in Britain in July, the media landscape might already be shaped in a very specific way. It could make his arrival feel like a natural continuation of something people have already accepted instead of the much more debated move that other records suggest. That shift in perception doesn't just happen on its own. It's built step by step through repeated coverage and carefully framed stories. Meanwhile, there's a whole separate track running alongside it. Independent voices, alternative commentators, citizen journalists, and observers are documenting details that don't always make it into the polished headlines. These are the people who pointed out the Bondi Beach listing, noted Jonathan Brady's byline, counted turnout at events, and even spoke to fans who left disappointed after limited access. That's a different layer of reporting, and it's happening without special access or pressure to maintain relationships. Because they're not tied into those access arrangements, they don't have the same limits. They can focus on what's directly visible and verifiable without needing to filter it through a communication strategy. And the result? A set of details that often don't appear in outlets like Heat magazine, but are still out there for anyone willing to compare both sides. Now zoom out and the bigger picture starts to come together. The narrative push is already in motion. The blueprint idea has shown up across multiple platforms, from the Telegraph to Heat, and it keeps getting reinforced with each repeat. At the same time, other data points sit right next to that coverage. Poll results, event turnout figures, photographer involvement, retail listings, and even formal complaints. Two streams of information, same environment, very different tone. And that's where awareness becomes key. Understanding how these PR mechanics work, things like feeding source quotes, arranging photo opportunities, and shaping narratives is essential here. These are standard tools in celebrity media strategy, now being applied within a much more structured, institutional setting. The real skill is spotting the pattern and recognizing how each piece fits into the bigger picture. What makes this operation stand out isn't the tools, it's the scale of what's being protected. Regular celebrity PR usually handles short-term issues, like a bad review, a career stumble, or a personal controversy. But this goes way bigger than that. Here, the focus is on maintaining the image of something much larger, an entire setup that depends on looking closely tied to the royal world, while still operating outside of its usual structure. And that's where the balancing act gets tricky. The coverage has to pull off two moves at the same time, and they don't naturally fit together. On one side, it presents the couple as closely connected, to royal spaces visiting hospitals, appearing at memorial sites, working with approved photographers, all wrapped in a charitable image. But at the same time, it pushes the idea that they're fully independent, running their own path without needing approval or oversight. That tension is baked right into the narrative. The Heat magazine piece leans hard on the blueprint idea to hold that balance together. It frames Harry as building something new, something that could impress the royals, rather than working within the existing structure. That's a key shift. It turns the operation into an offer the institution might want, instead of something that challenges the boundaries already set. It's a clever repositioning, and it keeps the story moving in a more favorable direction. But then you hit something that doesn't fit so neatly, the Roy Morgan polling data. Because if this new approach was landing the way it's being presented, you'd expect strong public support to match. Instead, the numbers point the other way, with a large majority saying their opinion didn't improve after the tour. That's not a split reaction, it raises real questions about how well that narrative is actually connecting. That result isn't vague, it's a clear rejection of what the tour was trying to sell. The blueprint that sounded impressive in theory didn't land the same way with the public in the first place. It was rolled out. That's a major gap, and it's exactly the kind of detail missing from the Heat magazine piece, because including it would force a direct clash. Those glowing source quotes claiming success would run straight into independent data showing a very different reaction. And that creates a problem moving forward, because the same strategy now shifts toward Britain, where the environment is much tougher. The British public isn't coming in fresh. They've been following this story closely for years. There's a long trail of coverage already in place. Major interviews, documentaries, published accounts, legal disputes, and ongoing commentary that have all shaped public perception over time. That means the starting point isn't neutral, it's already formed, and in many cases, more critical. A strategy that works best on a neutral audience has a harder time gaining traction when people already have strong opinions. The same messaging has to push through years of existing narratives, not just introduce something new. And then there's the institutional side, which adds another layer. The situation hasn't been defined by a sharp public break. Instead, there are signs of quiet accommodation, things like continued listings, lack of formal title changes, the use of established media channels, and internal reviews that haven't led to clear, decisive outcomes. That kind of approach leaves space for multiple interpretations, because if there had been a clear and public separation, the media framing would look very different. Without that clarity though, the current strategy still has room to operate, filling in the gaps, shaping perception, and continuing to push its version of events into the spotlight. No amount of coverage from Heat magazine alone can create the feeling of real institutional backing. That part has to come from somewhere higher up. What keeps this narrative alive is the uncertainty coming from leadership, the mixed signals, the careful silence, the wait-and-see approach. That ambiguity is exactly what the media strategy feeds on. Without it, the whole setup loses momentum, because there's nothing unclear left to shape or reinterpret. But then there's a direct challenge to that space: Prince William's firm stance. Reports that he would exclude Harry from a major future event send a message that's hard to spin away. It's specific, it's tied to credible reporting, and it cuts through the softer narrative being built elsewhere. When a well-connected journalist confirms strong tension at that level, it carries weight that can't just be brushed off as background noise. And that's where things start to collide. On one side, you've got these source quotes claiming Harry believes the institution needs him and that big plans are in motion. On the other, you've got clear signals suggesting limits and resistance. That contrast puts a ceiling on how far the softer narrative can go, no matter how many times it's repeated. Through the summer, both versions are going to exist side by side. The polished, access-driven coverage will keep pushing one angle, while independent reporting and documented details continue telling another story. They won't cancel each other out, they'll compete for attention in the same space. And at that point, it comes down to how people read it. Someone who looks at the glowing blueprint claims, then checks independent polling, or hears about strong turnout, and then looks at actual event details, that's where the full picture starts to form. Being able to compare both streams instead of taking one at face value is what really matters here, because that's how you see what's being highlighted and what's being left out. At the core of it, this strategy is betting that most people won't stop and compare the details. It relies on quick reads, repeated headlines, and familiar talking points landing without much pushback. On the other side, independent voices are betting that enough people will take that extra step and look closer. And that's where the next phase this summer becomes important, because it adds another layer of evidence to everything that's already out there. Right now, all the pieces are sitting in the same space. The blueprint has been introduced, the media push is clearly in motion, and the same types of source quotes are showing up in outlets like Heat magazine. At the same time, you've got polling data, photographer involvement, and detailed accounts of what actually happened on the ground in places like Melbourne and Sydney, all of it available, unchanged, waiting for anyone willing to line it up side by side. And that's the key point. It's not about missing information, it's about whether people connect it. The pattern described by insiders starting with softer outlets and gradually moving up the media ladder matches what's already played out during the tour coverage. The earliest positive stories came from the least critical platforms, then slowly expanded outward. Even when the coverage looks more credible, the structure often stays the same. The Daily Telegraph's blueprint angle leaned heavily on sources close to the couple, and other reporting around media disputes also depended almost entirely on one side's input. Each article on its own might seem convincing, but when you stack them next to polling numbers and independent observations, a more coordinated picture starts to appear. And here's where that approach runs into trouble, because broad claims can be challenged by specific details. It's easy to say the public reception was incredible, but that kind of statement hits differently when people start checking actual turnout, reactions, and measurable data. That's where the gap becomes impossible to ignore. The contrast couldn't be clearer. The Roy Morgan poll shows 81% of people weren't convinced, while the Heat piece pushes the idea that Australia was a big success. Then you've got visuals like sparse crowds and quiet moments that tell a completely different story. That gap between the claim and the observable details isn't vague, it's sharp, specific, and easy to measure. And the only way the polished version holds up is if people don't stop to compare it with everything else available. That's where independent commentary steps in, and its role is pretty direct. It lines those two sides up next to each other so the difference is impossible to miss. Without that, a lot of people would only see the polished headline version and move on. But once the comparison is made, the story starts to look very different. And this pattern didn't just start in Australia, it's been repeating. Earlier stops like Jordan and Ukraine followed a similar path. Mainstream coverage leaned warm and positive, while separate documentation painted a more complicated picture. Each time, the gap was noted, and then the narrative rolled forward into the next event. Take Jordan. For example, images involving venue staff with controversial online activity were picked up and discussed in independent spaces, but didn't get the same attention in larger outlets. Or the Ukraine visit, where the level of coordination required for that kind of appearance raised questions for observers who understand how these trips are arranged. Those details were acknowledged in some circles, but not explored in depth in the broader coverage. When you stack all these moments together, a pattern starts to form. Each engagement produces two tracks, one polished and widely distributed, the other more detailed and selective. And over time, each new event builds on the last, slowly reinforcing a broader narrative. That's what this whole approach comes down to. It's not about one headline or one trip, it's a sequence, moving step by step, each phase adding weight to the next. Different locations, different contexts, but a consistent push in the same direction. And with each round, the framing edges a little further, trying to make what once sounded unlikely feel more normal, more expected, and more accepted over time. Each stop in this sequence plays a different role, and when you line them up, the pattern becomes hard to ignore. Jordan brought in the global humanitarian angle tied to major organizations and international framing. Ukraine added that military connection through Invictus-style visibility. Australia then stepped in with the full royal tour-style Commonwealth setting, structured appearances, and even the presence of an approved photographer to lock in the visuals. And now Britain sits as the final piece, where the focus shifts to direct, domestic institutional connection, the point everything else has been building toward. Seen in that context, the Heat magazine coverage isn't meant to flip public opinion overnight. It's just one step in a longer rollout. The polling already shows that opinions didn't suddenly change, and that's not the goal here. The goal is softer but more strategic. Introduce and repeat the groundbreaking blueprint idea in lighter media spaces, so it starts to feel familiar. Then, as bigger outlets begin to echo it, they can point back and say, this has already been gaining attention, giving the story more weight than it started with. That's why the order matters so much. This isn't random, it's layered. Each piece adds to the next, building momentum over time. Once you understand how PR actually works, things like targeting easier platforms first, feeding consistent source quotes, managing access, setting up visuals, and shaping the narrative, it stops looking mysterious and starts looking methodical. And that's the real insight here. It's not about some hidden operation happening out of sight, it's about a very visible process playing out in real time. If you know what to watch for, the signs are right there. Articles that feel like press releases often follow that structure for a reason, and those perfectly aligned source quotes, they hit the exact points they're supposed to, because they were designed that way from the start. The outlets that leave out details like the Bondi Beach clothing listing aren't doing it by accident, they're doing it on purpose. Including something like that could risk the access that helped produce the entire piece in the first place. And that's not some shocking twist, it's standard practice in the celebrity PR world. The only difference here is the scale of what's at stake. Because this isn't just about image, it's about maintaining the appearance of royal connection while running a commercial operation that sits outside the usual structure. And that's the real play. The strategy itself isn't unusually complex, it's built on familiar tools, but the target is much bigger, shaping how the public sees what's really going on. At the same time, there's a whole layer of independent voices pushing back citizen journalists, detailed commentators, and observers who track the small things like event turnout or who's behind the camera. That level of detail makes the narrative much harder to control. Now heading into the summer, expect things to ramp up even more. The media push won't slow down, it'll expand. Pieces in outlets like Heat will be followed by broader coverage, then picked up by larger platforms that start referencing earlier reports to build momentum. That's how the cycle grows, step by step, until the story feels fully established. So the real question is, are people just reading the headlines, or are they comparing everything side by side? That's where the difference shows. If you want more breakdowns like this, make sure to like, subscribe, share, and drop your thoughts in the comments.